You can support the Double Loop Podcast by contributing at patreon.com/Double Loop Podcast. Thank you to our supporters, and we hope you enjoy the show.
All right, so as we had discussed previously, we're going to just really now do a deep dive on these images, and this is much more technical for the technically minded examiner, the examiner who's trained in latent print comparisons, or at least interested in following latent print comparisons. And right from the outset, Matt, I think it's fair to say that these are fairly complex images, and going into this, they have to realize that these are difficult, to say the least.
Yes, these are definitely difficult. I would not give these to a new trainee and expect
but you did.
Great results.
But we were, as a reference to the last episode, you did give it at your National Training Academy.
We do give them to our training academy, but we don't expect great results.
Right, and as a learning exercise.
That's
all right.
Exactly it.
All right, so just to back up a little bit, when you receive these images, did you receive these as L1 and L2, or did you receive them as a larger group? You received each of these individually, right?
Yeah, so these are an old photographic process called a CrimCon. I don't know if any of the listeners will be familiar with a CrimCon, but that's what these are. So this photograph that we're looking at now, this L1, it's not previously labeled in the ABI worksheets and reports. They're labeled as latent number 1 and latent number 2. So L1 is their latent number 1 and L2 is their latent number 2, and we just stuck with that numbering.
Did you know that there was a relationship between the two, that there was a potential simultaneity? Did you have any of that going into that?
No, we just knew that they were on the same wallboard. So this photograph we're looking at now is on about a 4x5 sheet of almost feels like thermal paper, and L2 is on a separate sheet, and the known prints are on a separate sheet as well.
All right, and what we're looking at right now that have markings on it, these are the original Alabama Bureau of Investigation ABI markings, correct?
Yeah, so this is how we receive it. So these red dots are put on by the latent print unit of the ABI.
Right, okay. So this is L1, and then do you have a second image too?
Yeah, so there's a second print on here as well. There we go, there's L2.
All right, and these have all the appearance of being in a blood matrix. They certainly, have all those characteristics that you expect: the pooling of the blood, potential consideration for tonal reversals, and other kinds of things you're dealing with certainly a wet matrix, a fluid matrix.
Definitely, as you're working on your analysis, definitely be thinking painted drywall, impressions left in blood, and exactly like you said, all the factors that go into an analysis of a bloody impression.
All right. Well, Matt, why don't you walk us through a little bit and show us how you guys approach these?
Well, so when we first got these, they had the red dots on them, and there's corresponding red dots on the known prints as well. So L1 had been identified by the Alabama Bureau of Investigation as being identified to the left index finger of Beniah Alton Dandridge. L2 had been identified as the left middle finger of Mr. Dandridge. And so if you look at these images side by side, there's corresponding dots marked by the ABI between these images. There's a slide kind of showing them a little bit better arranged. When you look at these, you'll see 12 dots. There's one that's a little bit more hidden. It's a little bit harder to see. It's right up in there, but you'll see that marked on the known print as well. When the examiner testifies this, and we didn't know this till after the fact, when the examiner testifies to this identification, she says she has 14 points of identification.
Wow.
Here we just see 12 in the markup. As we look at L2, they say that they have 9, and we can see all 9 of them being marked up as what they were seeing as the corresponding features for an identification.
I should also probably jump in here, too, just for any listeners. I mean, this is 1994. There is no gyro that exists, and even though these are all marked as red, we should not assume any level of certainty was placed on these, or any, as we discussed in the previous episode, any assessment of specificity, clarity, certainty, etc. These are all just marked generically.
That's correct.
Right. Yeah, I can tell you that I had nowhere near that number of features marked myself using gyro through this. Now that you have these images, I assume that you have to essentially move past their markings and attempt to mark them up, on your own.
So the way this examination actually took place, we received the images in on a Wednesday. That same Friday afternoon, about 3 o'clock, I finished up a case, so I had a couple hours left in my day. And if you look at these latent prints, at first blush, you think, well, I've got a delta in one, I have quite a few ridges. The other one, I've got a core, I've got quite a few ridges. I actually thought this comparison really probably wouldn't take me very long. So I did pretty quick analysis on the L1 and L2 prints, and I moved into the comparison. I found I found my target group in the latent, found where that should be in my known print, and start working my way through the print. And I didn't make it very far on my first target group before I realized everything just fell apart. So I figured I must have a bad target group. So I moved to the other side of the print, found a new target group, start over in the known, and move out. And again, the comparison fell apart. And I did that 3 separate times. Each time the comparison just kept falling apart. And so I realized pretty quickly that this is not a Friday at 3 o'clock kind of comparison. I thought I'd better come back on Monday after a nice weekend, rested, recouped, fresh eyes, and we're going to look at this again. And over the course of the weekend, I had quite a bit of time to just kind of think about how best to tackle this. And as I went into how to tackle this, I actually had multiple images of the latent prints. And in fact, I had 7 additional photographs of the latent prints. And you can see those on screen right now. So not only the ones that were marked up, you can see these ones. And there's some interesting features about these. These have been water damaged, and you can see the water damage in the images. You can see a very nicely manicured finger over here in one, indicating something. So these are just some photographs of these same impressions. But each of these photographs show different areas of ridge detail. And I knew from working in full-service crime laboratories that firearms examiners sometimes will take their test fires from their gun and they'll intercompare their test fires before they move into a comparison to try to establish a threshold for what features should and should not or will not reproduce from test fire to test fire. And I thought, well, I have these additional 7 photographs, so let me try that with this. So what I did is I actually went, and in each of these images, I traced out the ridge details. You can see that in this slide in green. And so I enhanced the images, all 7 of them. I did an additional analysis on them. I marked my features, my lines of distortion in orange, so you can see that on each of these images. I marked them in orange. And then I went through all 7 of these, and I traced out in green dots the ridge detail, just trying to establish a threshold for what is reliable between each of these images and what ridge detail is not reliable. And so that was my starting point. So I did that for both L1 and L2.
I got to tell you, that is really smart to do. And in the statistical world, I mean, that's called intra-source variability. That's really very, very smart. And then frankly, we often don't get that opportunity because what you essentially did was do samplings from your specimen. And so you're getting multiple looks of the same ridge detail, but from different views and different vantage points and different levels of clarity. Really, really good move there.
Well, I appreciate that. That makes what I did sound smarter than it seemed like. So
if you're a trace analyst and you have a paint sample, this is taking multiple samplings of paint from various areas around there to look at what's consistent throughout and not just a one-off in the small area that you sampled. I mean, this is very, very smart. This is good forensic science.
Well, good. I'm glad to hear that. So if I do that same process on the original image that's marked up by ABI, and I trace all the ridge detail, and then I pull the ABI markup back over top of it, what you're going to see is that features that are marked by the ABI are actually marked in areas that are continuous ridges. So having marked those up as a latent-to-latent comparison, and then bringing back up the ABI markings, what I see is I actually see that in certain areas there are ridge features that are marked where in fact the ridges are continuous. Not only that, we see other areas where I have these orange lines marked for distortion, and we can see that there's a few lines marked on what appear to be these lines of distortion. And we know that you can use features on lines of distortion, but extreme caution is warranted when you start doing something like that.
Fair enough.
So I did this with L1, and then at this point in time, obviously, you can tell that the ABI markup just is not reliable. So if I discard the ABI markup, do comparison based off of my analysis, this threshold I've tried to establish with this latent-to-latent comparison, it's pretty clear that this is not an identification. In fact, this is an exclusion. Now, you're going to see on this slide other features that do not correspond other than the ones that I've marked up. There's other things here that are not in agreement. These are just the ones that are most obvious to me. And the way to read this is if you look at the left-hand slide, or left-hand image, where it says there's a large ridge spacing, then over on the right-hand side you'll see a normal ridge spacing. If on the left-hand side it says present, that's because there's ridge features where those errors are indicating that are present, and on the right-hand side those same features are absent. And likewise at the bottom where we see these ridge features in a pretty close relative position, then on the known print we see that they're in a much larger relative position to each other. There's more spacing between those features. Again, as you work through these images yourself, and I hope everybody does, you'll probably see some other things that don't correspond, but these were just the ones that were most apparent to me, easiest to document. And so we do the exact same process then. So L1 is an exclusion.
But I mean, we'll play the other side of this. There is a lot of correspondence here for a random association, meaning that this was not an APHIS hit. There really is a lot of correspondence, and we can't move. I can't move past that because it's, to me, it's, and I'm not in any way justifying their conclusion, because you're right, there are differences there, but I can begin to understand how the error happened. The fact that, hey, take a look at this guy. We think he might have been involved. And you start to find these correspondences, you go, wow, this is fairly incredible.
And let me point out, too, that the ABI at this point in time has only the fingerprint card of Mr. Dandridge. And let me give you an idea of the turnaround time. This crime happens on December 18th, 1994. December 19th at 9-something in the morning, the ABI gets this submitted to them. On the 20th, Mr. Dandridge is brought in for questioning and arrested. On the 21st, we see the dates on the worksheet and the report. So we have some, and we know that Mr. Dandridge was brought in for questioning and arrest based on the fingerprint comparison. So we have some idea that the ABI turned this around in less than 2 days. 3 days max. Because of the date of their worksheet and report, but really we know that Mr. Dandridge was brought in on the 20th, so we're looking more likely 2 days. So this is a fast turnaround time, and they only have one person's fingerprint card to compare. They have 3 copies of Mr. Dandridge's fingerprint card, and then on the 21st they receive an additional fingerprint card of Mr. Dandridge, and they're asked to compare that fingerprint card to the other ones. I'm sure they're looking at making sure that the guy that's being arrested is the same person whose fingerprints they...
and even with these images here, I mean, I see 3 features in the latent, not in the known, that stand out pretty clear to me right in there. I mean, that really stands out nicely. If you follow that ridge up to some other features that don't appear present, just follow that ridge right up along there. And right there, that would start to, question. But beyond that, I mean, I can still count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 features in relative correspondence across an area. And
well, I would say that the features you're seeing are these are the features that the Alabama people marked. So the unfortunate thing for Alton Dandridge, not just that he's got some similarities, but more specifically that the latent that was left by Junior with the distortion in the latent, the distortion happened to look like some of his things here, because what Matt had marked up, from the various images, didn't include like this marked short ridge with this ending right here, or bifurcation next to it. But that is what appears here in Dandridge's print.
And with good ridge count and good sequence, if that's how they saw it, if that's how they interpret it.
Right.
We don't know that they did more of a linear ACE either, that they started with the latent, marked things up, and didn't have the known exemplar present. And in the 90s, that might not have been standard practice back then either.
Right.
So let's move into L2. So we do the same process with L2. We digitally enhance the images that we have. We do the analysis again. And then I do this latent to latent process. And this slide up that you see right now is a good indication of what you can see in one image but not in another. You see this kind of arrow-shaped area of distortion that I've outlined with the orange on the right-hand image, and you can see some of the ridge detail up above that. And while you can very faintly see some of the ridge detail on the left side image, you really can't make that out very clearly at all. And so we see this from image to image on all 70 of these latent prints. Some of them record details that are not visible in the other images. And so we do this latent to latent comparison on all 7 of those images, and then I move, in fact, let's take a look now. If we pull that up and do the tracing of the ridges again in green, the distortion in orange, and then if we look at where the ABI had those marked up, and that's in the net, thank you, Eric. So then as we look at this slide, you can see where the ABI had those features marked up. And so this one is, right here, this is on a continuous ridge. And so what my analysis showed was a continuous ridge. Now, in fact, we see the ABI had marked up features, once again, on areas that were continuous ridges. And it also becomes pretty apparent, and you could see this on the initial examination, that we've got some features marked in really areas that have they have a lot of background interference, and what's causing that big red or big black blotch right here at the delta, whether that's blood or these prints were actually processed with ninhydrin and then powder, whether that's an artifact of the processing technique or photography techniques, we don't really know. But we do see that they're marking features in these areas with some pretty big background issues with them.
Yeah, in my experience, that tends to be excess matrix, so excess blood.
And that wouldn't surprise me.
Before you go on, the feature that you were looking at in the delta that was marked on the ridge, would you agree, though, that there looks to be one below that?
Yeah, so if we're looking at this in terms of connective ambiguity, certainly we would allow that.
Thank you.
But let's look at this in terms of a holistic approach between L1 and L2. And if we just are looking at, is the ABI markup reliable or unreliable, I do see features like that as well as in the other the L1 impression, and I see the features that are being marked in areas that have significant background issues. This ABI markup just is not reliable. That being the point. Certainly, again, connective ambiguity would allow for that feature to exist, and if they marked it one ridge, the ridge ends down below and they marked it up above, or it's actually a bifurcation. Certainly, given the quality and quantity of details in this print, or I shouldn't even say quantity, the quality of features in this print, that would be allowed. I would absolutely agree with that.
And this comes, though, again, from your 7 latent image approach, that your features marked, your ridge tracings, this is being informed by all these different looks at these latents, which again is brilliant.
Well, thank you. And if we're looking for other features, we can look up here as well, and we can see where there's a feature marked, and once again, we see continuous ridges right around that.
Yeah.
So anyway, if we move forward, then
and then also this one over here that is not marked, and but it's pretty clear from the images that you've combined together.
Yeah, I had that
right,
and green.
If you have listened to the other podcast about this, what we discussed is that we have 9 features in a pattern forced area, and the weight that should be applied to these 9 features, that some of them may or may not exist in a pattern forced area, really carries some low specificity. And so as we work our way out of that, like you said, Eric, if we go out from the delta, we can see at least a few ridges, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 6, and if that's a ridge, then 7 ridges out from the delta. Then, in fact, we see this feature coming down. And if we work our way outside of the pattern forced area, that's really where we see this comparison falling apart.
Yeah.
So this is the markup of the exclusion. This reads just the way the last one did on the left-hand image where it says that something is absent. That's because on the right-hand image we're going to see a ridge event is present. Likewise, on the left-hand image where it says there's a ridge event present, on the left-hand side we'll see, in fact, those ridge events are absent. And then there's one far out to the right-hand side where we see on the latent that's a continuous ridge, and on the known print that same area is actually a ridge event. So we see, once again, too many differences between these two prints for it to be explainable by the features we see in our analysis. This is absolutely an exclusion. So L1 and L2 are both exclusions.
I want to jump in here real quick and say I really like what you've done here in the documentation of an exclusion, or the documentation explaining the basis of the exclusion. Because that is something that is, I mean, technically is in, even going back to SWGFAST standards, something we're supposed to be doing is documenting the basis for our conclusion, which includes exclusion. And but as a field, one of the reasons we're not doing it is because no one's really figured out a good way to do it. And I like what you're doing here, and it's kind of, sparked some ideas, maybe even kind of continuing on with the color scheme from Gyro to include a color to mark things that are absent or present. But especially for something like this, where you're looking at a latent to one finger, it really works out well. Would also work out well for close non-matches. For just a regular old exclusion, when you're just looking at all 10 fingers, it starts to be a little more difficult to utilize. But anyway, I just want to say that this definitely is giving ideas moving forward on ways to actually do this.
Yeah, Eric, I've had some erroneous identifications in my private casework, and I will tell you that they are the hardest things to have to prove the exclusion. Not just that the examiner didn't have sufficiency, or the examiner, had some feature, or that it should have been inconclusive, but to show that the examiner had an incorrect conclusion and that the true, or maybe better word, appropriate conclusion was exclusion.
Right.
Those are very hard to document, and I think you're absolutely right. Matt has done a great job here of documenting. This is not just it's not him. This is not just an inconclusive, but I can demonstrate the basis for an exclusion decision.
Well, and hence why it was 200 plus hours of man hours to going into this. Exclusions are hard, or can be.
What we did then is we gave a verbal report to the attorneys. So we needed to convey our results certainly to the attorneys, and we did that on May 22nd, 2014. The attorneys came and met at our office, and we demonstrated to them the exclusions. We used those exact same images of the slides that we've looked at. We also had, at the time, a fingerprint card for the son of the victim, Riley Manning Jr. He's the individual who found his father's body as a result of a welfare check on his father. And what we determined was that there was significant agreement with Mr. Riley Manning Jr.'s fingerprints with his left index and left middle, but the known prints for the corresponding areas where we had clear detail in the latent prints just were too poorly recorded in the known prints for us to be able to render a definitive conclusion. But we definitely wanted to try to get a better quality copy of Mr. Manning Jr.'s fingerprint card to see if we could come to a definitive conclusion. And we gave our verbal results, and after we gave our verbal results of the exclusions and also the level of correspondence, albeit not enough for an identification with the known prints that we had of Riley Manning Jr., the attorneys brought with, and here's a slide of the prints we had. So what you can see is that in the latent impression, L2, that went actually down into the joint, we really needed some more detail down below the delta down here. Now moving to the inside of that image, to the more toward the pattern area of that known print, we see that detail is decently recorded right here. But if we go over to the L1 impression, you can see we're working around the core, the area below the core, and a little bit toward the delta on the latent print. That area just is not clearly recorded on the known print. So we needed to get further below the delta on the L2 impression, and we need clearer detail of the L1 impression around the core, and we just didn't have that with that set of known prints. So we told the attorneys we wanted them to try to pursue better quality known prints. So the attorneys brought 2 big cardboard boxes of additional documents of everything they had in the case for us to be able to look through, and we did. So after we gave our verbal results, we dug through these boxes of case documents, and one of the things we came across was this image. This image that you're seeing now actually displays a third impression on the left-hand side. Now you may be wondering what this shape is over here. This feature underneath the L3 print, that is where they sample the drywall for biological testing. And so that's actually a cutout in the drywall. You can see the initials of the examiner, and unfortunately they got a little bit into the ridge detail. And also unfortunately, L3 is one of those prints that you just find yourself thinking, oh, if I just had a little bit more, if I could just have a little bit more, every little bit in that print helps.
Yeah.
But unfortunately some of that just got sampled away, and we don't have an image of L3 prior to that occurring. So we had these 3 impressions on the drywall. And when we first saw this, obviously this took us some time at the office after we met with the attorneys. You can see down below, real faintly, down below the images, you can see where they've labeled these, so we can be confident in labeling these latent number 1 and latent number 2. We know exactly which prints they're talking about. They did label that on the photograph. And so we see these prints now, and we can look at these for the first time in terms of simultaneity. Are these latent impressions left at the same time? And so we did some work on that. We analyzed the prints pretty thoroughly, and this was our conclusion, that they are in fact simultaneous. And let me explain this slide a little bit. First of all, you'll see a horseshoe shape in red over top of the impressions, and that's just to show that they're in the correct anatomical orientation for the deposition of a left index, left middle, left ring. The other thing that we're looking at is the angle of deposition. Now, we're not looking at it for the angle of deposition to be exactly the same, right? Our fingers can move out from each other. They can move closer to each other. And this is also left in blood. But what we do see is a lower right to upper left orientation on each one of these prints. And then the last thing we're looking for is the distortion that we see in these prints, or the manner in which these prints deposited, other than just angle of deposition and orientation. Do we see other features that would lend us to believe that these were left at the same time? And we see distortion in the upper right-hand corner of each one of these impressions. So it is our opinion that each of these impressions were left at the same time, and they are in fact simultaneous impressions. So we actually have 3 bloody prints on the wall board above the victim's head in this case.
You know, one thing that when I was doing my examination for simultaneity, it's the distortion in the upper right that caught my attention. Because although we haven't discussed this, Matt, and Eric and I might get into this when we do our individuals, I believe that there is actually double tap motion going on in the left middle and left index finger, and it looks like they've made contact in the upper right and then have pivoted at some point. And I'll show listeners where I see some misalignment of ridges, but I suspect that there is some pivoting and movement throughout the finger, and in fact running right through the center axis. But I don't know if you had picked up on that and you're noticing this distortion in the upper right, but to me, when I look at especially the left middle finger, as you follow the contour of it, there are these little 90-degree angles, and you can't have a 90-degree angle in a latent print unless there is either double touch or double tap movement in the finger. And that really stood out to me, that they both had that.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I would absolutely agree with that. And so in fact, it's almost on the right-hand print, the L1 print. The area that you're talking about is almost entirely enclosed within this blue box. And that's exactly what we're talking about. Yes. We do see this distortion in the upper right-hand corner of each one of them. And this slide merely speaking to the matter of simultaneity. that does give additional weight toward the simultaneity. And if
Absolutely.
we're talking about a double tap, certainly any of those odd angles, ridges don't typically run a 90-degree angle in that area of a print, and so for that to occur would definitely lean toward multiple touches. I would agree.
Yeah. So the second thing that occurs to me in looking at all the background staining, and maybe you can tie this into the statement that was made by Junior in the previous podcast, but are these impressions actually made in blood that's contaminated on the wall? So the finger is clean, not bloody, but touching into blood on the wall. Looking at the amount of contamination here, I'm wondering if that isn't the case.
I don't believe that's the case. I think what you're looking at is an artifact from photography. We do have the crime scene video from this, and there's no point at which they zoom in on the print enough to take a still photo out of the video and use that for comparison. But we can see, in general, how much blood is there, and if I understand what you're asking correctly, if we're looking for the volume of blood that you would be looking at where the same type of darkness over here and over here might be background staining, I don't believe that's going to be the case. And I'm happy to review that image again and get you a more definitive answer on that, because I'm recall from the last time I watched that video. But the wall is not heavily saturated in blood around these prints.
That's what it definitely looks like in this image. It looks like that there is a large volume of staining on the wall, and that he has touched into the impression, and that these might be basically made into blood as opposed to blood on the fingers touching a cleaner wall substrate.
Yeah, I think it's your second option there, and I think anything else you're looking at is really just an artifact of the method of photography, and could very well be an artifact of the amount of time that's passed.
And post-processing too, that this is after the black powder?
Yeah, so this is going to be after, and then, I should say, from what we can tell, and we do see that the tag on this image is actually an FBI tag, Federal Bureau of Investigation, so that lends me to believe that this particular photograph is actually taken by one of the two defense experts, which, given they said the second expert couldn't, I'm starting to narrow this down to probably the first expert. So as we look at this, we're definitely, if that's true, and that's a whole bunch of ifs, if that is true, then we are looking at this post-processing, yes. And processing is anhydrous hand powder. And so, again, as we look at background, if the background appears black, then that could very well be the result of powder. I don't know how much of that could be the result of powder, but those are all really good questions, really good things to take into consideration on the analysis.
Yeah, I don't know, some of the shapes here, it does, I would agree, look more like a processing artifact than all this being the actual blood, with just the prints in the kind of the void area.
Yeah, so if we take that L3 impression now and we compare it to Mr. Dandridge's prints, first of all, you can tell from the latent, we're dealing up in the tip and the side, which makes it a little bit more of a difficult comparison to Mr. Dandridge, because you can see the top of the known print is obscured. But the areas of the latent print that are closest to the core, we do have some features in the latent print that are pretty close to the core. We have a feature here, and we have another feature right here. Those should be recorded in the area that we see in the known print. And particularly the one that the mouse was just on, if we try to find where that could correspond in the known print, first of all, here is one option. Another option would be the ridge down to the inside one and down one. Now those, the first feature that the arrow was over, that's probably the more likely based on ridge count and position, but the lower one would certainly be one that we did and should consider. But if we move out or in even 4 ridges either direction between the latent and the known, it falls apart every time we try it. The most agreement that you can get between these two impressions is if you take this feature and you carry it over to this feature, and then you go in 4 ridges, 1, 2, 3, 4. You can see maybe if that's an ending ridge, and then the ridge down below it is a bifurcation, we're in a distorted area. But if that were to occur, then maybe that could be this feature over here in the latent. And that's a lot of ifs, and in fact those ridges appear to be continuous in the known print to me. But anything outside of that, it completely falls apart. And so L3 is also an exclusion to Dandridge's left ring. So as a result of some legal work, we have been looking for a while now at this point in time in the case for how can we get better quality copy known prints of the son of the victim, so Riley Manning Jr., who found his father, and during a police statement he then said that he had gotten blood on 3 fingers of his left hand. And so we have an opportunity to try to get better known prints. Now, Mr. Manning Jr. at this point in time is wholly convinced that Mr. Dandridge has killed his father, and he is not going to do anything to help in his defense. So just asking for a better quality copy of known prints is not really an option. And if you've worked very many cases like this, you'll know that the courts are not typically inclined to force a victim or an immediate family member of a victim to submit to those types of things. And so we knew that the Montgomery Police Department had copies of additional fingerprint cards for Riley Manning Jr., but they were not going to provide them outside of a court order. So Mr. Dandridge's attorneys did a lot of legal work and managed to get a signed court order allowing for the Montgomery Police Department to provide those images. And I got a notification that they were going to give us 5 copies of the known fingerprints. And so I was super excited. I thought this is going to be great. We're going to be able to come to a definitive conclusion on Riley Manning Jr. What we got was this fingerprint card that you see up on screen right now. This is the best quality image of the 5 that we got, and you can see it's moderate. The second fingerprint card that we got is actually a poorer quality copy of the same fingerprint card. So I was thinking, okay, well now we're down to 4 fingerprint cards. And then the third fingerprint card they gave us was actually worse quality copy than even the poor quality copy of the first card. And then they gave us a poorer quality copy of that same fingerprint card.
They didn't bother re-inking between each one, did they?
Yeah, something. And
there's a photocopy, yeah.
And then we get to the 5th fingerprint card, which is actually the 3rd fingerprint card, and it's just a series of lines and dots in the general shape of fingerprints on a fingerprint card. That's the worst quality copy of the fingerprint cards that we received. And so we had that first kind of moderate quality copy fingerprint to work with. The great thing is that it was fairly well recorded in the areas that we needed for the comparison. And that's really what we were missing from the first fingerprint card, the very original comparisons. So we were able to take the latent prints and compare them to Mr. Manning Jr.'s fingerprint cards. And here on screen you see the L1 impression side by side with the index finger, the left index finger of Riley Manning Jr. We did a comparison. On this next slide, you see my markup. Now, I feel the need to say this, and I've said this to Glenn and Eric a few times, and I say it every time I give this presentation. Our office does follow Gyro. If you're familiar with Gyro, it's a system that Glenn has put out there and been a proponent of, and we like, where you mark your high confidence features in green, your medium confidence features in yellow, your low confidence features in red, and the features that you find during the course of your comparison in orange. That is not what this slide shows. I can't say that enough. When I do a Gyro on this, it makes for a poor presentation because you can't see all those colors really clearly. So I just marked everything in green. Please don't read this slide as that Marvin guy has high confidence in all of these. Some of these are red. Some of these are, perfectly honest, some of these features are double red. But if I were to mark all of the features in correspondence, regardless of necessarily red, yellow, green, double red confidence, this is what I see. And
I don't see a problem with all these being green.
Well, that makes one.
Right, no, I'm kidding.
So yeah, some of these are definitely lower confidence features, but just for the sake of a presentation, the green is a little bit easier to see on screen than using all the other colors. So we see the correspondence of the features that I saw here. Also, as you get an opportunity to review these images yourself and do the comparisons yourself, please also recognize that examiners don't always see things exactly the same way. If you mark a feature and it's 1 ridge off of where I mark a feature, we're going to be within allowable differences on connective ambiguity, as we talked about before, between these prints. So don't be surprised if you're off by a ridge here or there compared to my markup. My markup is not the definitive answer. It's just what I see.
That's fair.
So we do the same thing with the L2. Now L2 on this slide, you're going to see two images, and I needed to give two images because the image furthest to the left shows the core, or the area between the delta and the core the most clearly, and some of the areas up above the delta to the upper right of the print most clearly, but it does not record all the details that are down in the joint area. And so you're going to see two images of L2 here. These are pulled. The first one is that one that had the ABI red dot markup. The second one is from one of those series of 7 images that I did the latent to latent comparison on. And again, if we move to the next slide, you're going to see the correspondence of features. And again, in green, it's a little bit harder to see on this screen just because we have 3 images on the slide instead of just the 2. But you're going to see, again, what I saw as corresponding features between these 2 prints. Now you'll see some marked down in the joint, so that'll be the middle print to the right-hand known print, and then you'll see some features marked further up toward the delta and in toward the pattern area. One thing that I was really surprised to see, but certainly want to convey that it carries weight, is these open fields, these areas of no ridge events that we see between the delta and the core. Certainly we see the 1, but we have quite a big area of unobstructed ridge flow, and definitely need to convey that every ridge that corresponds or does not correspond carries weight in a comparison. And so we're looking at these areas of ridge flow where we do not see ridge features, but they still need to be in correspondence. And as you look at your exclusion, certainly, you need to be looking at ridge flow that, even if it doesn't have a ridge event, still carries weight as you look at your exclusions and, of course, as you look at your identifications.
Yeah, and you've got that second one to the right of the delta and up at around 2 o'clock or so, which is nice as well.
Yeah. So we've definitely got some good features in these prints. There are some solid features. Again, some of these features are not as high confidence as the others, but if I mark all the corresponding features that I see in the places that I see them, this is my markup. So then we can move into the L3 comparison. And L3, we didn't see any area more than 1, maybe 2 features that corresponded with Dandridge, but now we can actually see correspondence between these 2 prints. So now we can see, in fact, those 4 features that are clearly recorded in areas that are comparable and clearly recorded on the known print. We can see these 4 features that, in fact, do correspond correctly.
Those are the same 4 I marked in that one, by the way.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear that.
And with green as well.
And another big open field here.
Even better.
Yeah, and the open field, and I think I have one maybe yellow or red up near the tip.
Yeah, and you don't see me marking any of those up into the tip on this because the known print is poorly recorded in that area. But if you looked at my analysis will have more features marked up in that area. But again, just like we said on the last slide, open fields. I'm not here to teach about fingerprint theory, but I just can't hit it enough. There is value in every ridge. You need, as examiners, we've got to be analyzing every ridge for correspondence or discordance between the latent print and the known print, regardless of whether or not there's an actual level 2 feature.
Yep.
I was noticing in the ID, the apparent delta here from the 2 impressions. I wanted to check back what Dandridge had, and in this impression, or in this view from the original ID, the incorrect ID, you can't even see those other ridges that make an apparent delta here, and he doesn't even have a delta there anyway. So
that's exactly right. And if you look at the line of distortion, if you go back to my latent to latent analysis, you're going to see that I consistently have an orange line running right through where that delta is going to be.
Right.
And so, yes, if an examiner were to look at that and not notice the angles of the ridges, because the angles of the ridges are not appropriate there. We have, like Glenn was talking about, we have very sharp angles. and you consider that to be a true delta, I could definitely see examiners making a quick pass over and a comparison and saying, well, the delta to ridge count or delta to core count is not correct, move on to the next finger. And that would not be a correct conclusion there, because that is not a true delta. The angles of the ridges, again, do not correspond. And I think is that part of what you were referring to before when you said multiple impressions, Glenn?
Yeah, that's exactly it. The whole right side is off. But again, I hadn't actually done the comparison yet, so now that I'm seeing that, I'm going, well, no, my analysis was spot on there.
That's tricky though, because while it's mostly right angle right here, that's also the one place where you can get a right angle is a delta, and so the other ridges you could see them, as kind of blending back in. It's definitely a weird looking delta if it was true, but so it makes much more sense that it's just not a true delta.
Yeah,
but fake delta, man, that'll get you an erroneous exclusion. You got to be careful of those.
That's right. So that's where we arrived. We have the incorrect identifications to the ABI of L1 and L2. ABI actually only received the known prints of Dandridge to compare. It wasn't until we provided them the known prints of the son of the victim that they even had those in their case file.
Wow.
Nor did they have an image of the third print. They were shocked that they did not have anything in their case file with that third print.
That's amazing.
And so once we were able to give the current examiners at the Alabama Bureau of Investigation our markup, I just can't give them enough credit for their good work on this, and also we offered them as a professional courtesy the opportunity to issue the first report if they agreed with our conclusions. They replied that they did agree with our conclusions, and they did issue the first report on this. So definitely big kudos to the Alabama Bureau of Investigation's examiners that they have there. Just a good work, and not the easiest thing to be confronted with. And I just feel like they handled it appropriately when we had an opportunity to give them the information that they needed.
Yeah, I totally agree. Other agencies, may have dragged their heels or stuck to their guns, much like the McKee kind of situation, or not wanted to reveal or make available all the images. So this goes for both them and you guys at Ron Smith and Associates. No one knows what the John Leonard Orr fingerprints look like from California, because that agency just won't release the images. But this is great for the entire field to be able to see these things.
Well, yes. Absolutely our pleasure, and we just can't say it enough. We hope everybody takes those images and gives themselves an opportunity to analyze them, compare them, and come up with their own determinations, and just be able to have that opportunity to be able to look at them and say, if this were me, if this were my case, what decision would I make? And we as an industry and our examiners across the world, we need to take those opportunities when we get them to look at what's been done and just learn from them and evaluate ourselves introspectively. So I hope everybody gets a chance to do that. If you would like a copy of the images and you don't have them, we're happy to provide them. I don't generally provide my markup because I want people to do their own markups, but I'll be happy to, of the identifications, the correct identifications, but I'm happy to provide the other images in the case, and everybody's welcome to just contact me for those images. You can reach me at our main office phone number, which is 601-626-1100, or you can email me at mmarvin@ronsmithandassociates.com.
As we wrap things up here, Matt, is there any upcoming courses or academies that listeners might be interested in?
Oh, absolutely. Ron Smith and Associates, we offer a lot of training all around the world at any given point in time, and please check our website. That's www.ronsmithandassociates.com for our latest listing. Glenn, of course, is an instructor with us, travels all around the world teaching for us, and it's always a pleasure to go to his classes. If you get that opportunity, I highly recommend it. He's going to be talking about things that were very relevant in this case. He's going to be talking about things like connective ambiguity. He's going to be talking about things like pattern-forced areas and the weight that should be given to features in areas such as deltas, and just a great class that can help prepare you for the time cases like this do come across your desk. Eric as well also teaches a class. I've had an opportunity to take his exclusion class online, and certainly I think that you can go to Eric's website, and I'm sure he'll tell you about that, for where you can see his class listings as well. But in addition, Ron Smith and Associates, we run the National Latent Print Examiner Academy. We're going to be having our 4th session coming up October 1st, 2018 through March 1st, 2019. That's 20 weeks of training down in Mississippi. It's held here in our hometown by our headquarters office, and just top-notch training, and it's an accelerated training program where we cover in 20 weeks an entire training program and send examiners that are ready for supervised casework back to their agencies. And we actually have a number of students who pay for themselves to go through the academy once they have their bachelor's degree, trying to get into the industry. So that's another route to get into the industry, and of course, I'm happy for people to take that. We're always excited to see students enroll for that. I teach 5 weeks of that academy. Our lab director also teaches 5 weeks of that 20-week academy. You get to do hands-on training side by side with Ron Smith himself, as well as others of our full-time examiners. So it's a great opportunity. If you never have had a chance to sit down side by side with Ron and work through cases, you'll have that opportunity at our academy.
Fantastic.
All right.
I could use some of that.